Genetics are overrated when it comes to talking about lifting and sports. More specifically, speculating on other people's genetics in a way that implies that we know way more than we actually do know is overrated. To be clear, I'm definitely not saying that there are not heritable traits, unevenly distributed amongst the population, which play a huge role in determining our potential to perform in various sports and endeavors. There are, of course. They play a role. But how big is that role? Honestly, I don't know. But unless you're a geneticist or doing genetic testing on individuals and athletes to learn more about the role of these unseen factors, you probably don't benefit by thinking too much about it. First of all, we can't measure genetics. One day this might change. As we begin to understand different genotypes and how they lead to different observable phenotypes, it may one day be very useful to talk about genetics in the context of sport. For instance, certain phenotypes, like tall or short or heavy or overweight, we can say very useful things about training. For instance, short people tend to have better strength to weight ratios because regardless of their muscle mass, their soft tissues and bones weigh less. Thus, they tend to excel at things like calisthenics and gymnastics, where the strength to weight ratio is a really important stat. Taller people, on the other hand, can support more total mass and more muscle mass, which seems to be an advantage in raw strength sports like strongman. Overweight people often have relatively weaker joints and often have joint pain when they try higher impact activities like running. On the other hand, as far as I'm aware, we do not have reliable genetic tests to determine if people grow muscle easily, if they recover well, if they absorb nutrients well from the foods that they eat, etc. I believe there are a few papers linking specific genes to the distributions of muscle fiber types, which is really cool. But until there are valid and widely available tests to determine an individual's phenotypes, what are we actually talking about when we talk about genetics? Pretty much nothing. When people talk about another person's genetics, it's usually just blind speculation. The only info we actually have is observations about how quickly a person developed an attribute from whatever training they actually did. But it's impossible at this point to know precisely how much of a person's results are due to their genetics versus other factors like their strategy, their environment, and general lifestyle. So why do people on the internet actually say these things? Why do they speculate? Well, I've observed two reasons. First, people talk about genetics when they want to discredit the results or the methods of others. They'll say, oh yeah, well, that only worked because he's a genetic freak. Or, well, it's easy for this person, he's got great genetics. This is a very similar fallacy we see with ad hominem argumentation, where someone hears an argument and then they actually attack the person who said the argument's character rather than the points and the logic behind the argument itself. In contrast, I think the only constructive way to go about evaluating if a person's results are due to their training style and lifestyle is to actually evaluate the training style and the lifestyle, rather than just speculating about their genetics. And the best way to do that is to use personal experience and to try different strategies that you haven't yet tried. The second reason people like to talk about genetics is because they like to appear like they know more than they actually do. You kind of sound smart when you talk about genetics, until you realize that by genetics, most people actually mean nothing specific at all. I personally feel that people appear smartest when they actually think about the impact of their words and what they mean, and continue to evaluate and evolve their viewpoints over time. But that's just me. So we've discussed how an actual individual's genetics are essentially unknown to us. But in addition, they're uncontrollable. You can't change them. And for this point, I think it's very useful to borrow some ideas from the Stoics. There's a classic Stoic ideal which talks about having an internal locus of control. The idea about this is that you can divide all things into sort of two categories, those which you can have control or influence over, and those which you cannot. And if you're focusing your time and energy on things that you have no control over, well, you're just wasting your time. You literally can't impact those things. So for example, in this Venn diagram here, we have important things on the left. And that would be where genetics probably lies. It is important and does determine a lot of the outcomes in your life, but for the most part, you can't do anything about it. So it's good to be aware of, but if you spend too much time thinking about it, you're just wasting your time. On the other side, we have things which are controllable, but not that important. For instance, whether you eat casein protein versus whey protein and how soon you eat it after a workout. These are completely controllable by an individual, but I don't think they're that important to actually getting results. In that middle of the Venn diagram, where we want to actually focus our thoughts and our efforts, are things like actually training. Just doing the work, showing up with consistency, applying progressive overload, and getting good sleep. These are the things that actually move the needle, that are important and within our control, and that's what 90% of our energy should be focused on. So now I'll share a bit of a personal anecdote with y'all. I wouldn't say that I have much talent at all for sports and athletics. In high school, I ran cross country, and I was the slowest person on my team 2 years in a row. My best 5K time was 22 minutes and 36 seconds. If you know anything about the sport of cross country, you'll notice that that is terrible. I also ran track and field for 2 years, and I was also one of the slowest people in all of the sprinting events. I believe my best 100 time never broke the 14-second mark. So I was bad, like really bad. But is that because of my bad genetics? I literally have no idea. Maybe partly, but maybe it was because I spent 25 years of my life eating mostly Doritos and Mountain Dew, and I never properly trained at an intensity appropriate for beginners. Maybe it was because my entire high school career I stayed up all night playing video games instead of actually sleeping. But I don't know. I can't verify it. But here's what I can say for certain. When I started training with intensity, I started getting stronger and putting on muscle quickly. When I started running at a low heart rate, my endurance and my running speed slowly increased. When I started stretching with intensity, I started getting more flexible and eventually got the splits. When I started eating whole foods, I got leaner, I had more energy, and I recovered. When I started going to sleep earlier, I had more energy for both physical and mental work. I'd say it's probably too late for me to become a professional athlete or an elite performer, but I'm still going to continue to improve for as long as I possibly can. I'm going to get the one-arm chin-up, and I'm going to continue doing them into my 50s. I'm going to continue to improve my climbing for at least 2 decades to come. Worrying about your genetics is wasting energy by playing comparison games. Instead, I can just focus on doing the work and on progressively improving my strategies over time to find out what inventions work best for me. I believe that 100% of people who take positive actions, who implement habits which are known to cause positive outcomes, will achieve positive outcomes. I don't believe in non-responders. That's bullshit. There's always a strategy, something that can be done to improve yourself. You have to believe that. Just believe it. The only way that you can discover your potential is to try as hard as you possibly can. Prove to yourself you can't get stronger by actually strength training. Prove to yourself you can't grow muscle by hypertrophy training. Prove to yourself you can't gain or lose weight by actually implementing a diet and stick to it. Will the outcomes that people see be equal? No, of course not. They'll be distributed across a continuum. The only way to know your outcomes is to achieve them. The only way to improve is to do the work. So stop with the cope and start with the work. Living the good life is about trying to push the limits and to see what your potential really is. And you'll never know unless you try. Thanks so much for watching. Subscribe if you like this. Check out the links in the description for other resources. Thank you very much.